We're here to talk about an interesting little subgenre that the Andromeda strain, I think, typifies the outbreak movie, the pandemic movie. I think of them as decontamination suit movies. You know, the iconography of these is people in sort of spacesuits wandering through hospital wards filled with coughing, dying, sometimes ranting insane, sometimes mutating people who have been infected by some, usually sort of new strain of plague, occasionally an alien virus. In many films of recent years, this is a sort of zombie virus. Yeah, this is how we get our zombie apocalypses, and I think that derives a lot from Richard Matheson's thrice filmed novel I Am Legend, which is one of the big inspirations for Night of the Living Dead, in which it's a vampire virus rather than a zombie virus. But the origins of the genre, of course, are in stories about disease, plague, pestilence. I suppose we can look at weird classical texts like Edgar Allan Poe's Masque of the Red Death, Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, even, you know, all these stories of plague. There's a play called The Roses of Eyam about how plague affected Britain as well. And we have several medieval movies about the Black Death. Obviously, you know, in Europe, plague is a big thing. You know, it wiped out a significant percentage of the population in the Middle Ages. And we have various almost inspirational religious dramas about missionaries or pioneering doctors fighting plagues. That's Dr. Ehrlich's Magic Bullet. A very, very tactful Hollywood film about venereal disease. They start with these idea of almost the martyr, the image of Father Damien working among the lepers, even Jesus working among lepers, is it's part of our culture. But I think that the modern plague movie starts really in the 1950s with Elia Kazan's Panic in the Streets, in which Jack Palance plays a crook who is smuggled into New Orleans while suffering from a horrible and horribly infectious tropical disease. And he's pursued by Richard Widmark, who's sort of playing a health inspector, but he's also an FBI agent cracking down. The weird thing about it is that it's quite a sober film about a genuine medical issue, and it's genuinely something people are worried about. But also, it is part of those 1950s run of films that allegorize communism, or from another point of view, McCarthyism. You know, the disease that Jack Palance brings into the country is not just a real disease. It's a social disease, to quote West Side Story. Yeah, it's a spreading evil foreign ideology. As we're recording, it's just after Donald Trump's midterm campaign, where people were talking about the so-called migrant caravan crossing Central America. Yeah, there were people even saying, oh, they'll bring leprosy, a disease which is now entirely curable and treatable, or smallpox, a disease that no longer exists outside the laboratory. The idea of the illegal immigrant bringing a horrible disease is a reactionary notion that's embedded in Western culture. It's in Nosferatu, where Dracula brings a plague of rats to Bremen. Panic in the Streets is the 1950s encapsulation of this. It's also, I have to say, is one of my favourite Elia Kazan films, because it's not infected with the sort of stentorian pompousness, the significance that I think quite a lot of his films have. It's almost a throwaway for him, and it shows how good he was at just efficient get out on the streets. It's more like a Naked City, a Jules Dassin type film, than an Elia Kazan type film, and all the better for it. And it was modestly influential. There were a few other films I that took it as a model. I particularly like a kind of really gritty B noir called The Killer That Stalked New York, where it's a slinky femme fatale B-girl who's incubating a horrible plague that's going to spread and destroy the city. And our federal agent tough guys in sharp hats trying to track her down. And that has a sort of genuine nightmarish feel. The idea that plague is a subject for forensic medical documentary type movies and on the streets thriller type movies. I mean, you can look at these films and you see they're very like the sort of Anthony Mann movies, T-Man, He Stalked the Night, Border Incident, that have they're at once a hymn to the great public services of America, the Treasury, the FBI, the Border Patrol, and absolute shrieking nightmare visions of the crawling chaos that's nibbling at the edges of society and that only Jack Webb in Dragnet can keep down. It's very close, I think, to the vision of the more paranoid science fiction movies of the 1950s. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I suppose, is a kind of epidemic movie. And in Britain, we have the Quatermass Experiment, which is one of the great plague movies, in that the astronaut who comes back from space, rather like the space probe in the Andromeda strain, is incubating an organism, a disease, a not quite sentient animal, vegetable, mineral thing, which potentially threatens the entire human race. It's a enormously lethal and enormously infectious, and has to be burned out at the end by Quatermass with electricity, the same means used to destroy the Thing, who also, in John Carpenter's version at least, the Thing threatens the extermination of all humanity if it gets away from the frozen wastes into the populated areas. And there are a couple of other alien invasion or alien infection movies. Mutiny in Outer Space, Space Master X7. I don't know, Day of the Triffids even has that sort of feel to it. But to work, for me, these films have to sort of pull back a bit from that level of fantastical science fiction. I think there's a whole other genre, and maybe the zombie apocalypse genre is the sort of ultimate expression of that. They are, you can look at them and think that they probably feed off the same neuroses that we see in the pandemic movie, the Andromeda strain movie, the infection movie, but they go in a different direction. I think the next sort of big important title in the genre is The Satan Bug, from John Sturges film from the late 1960s, based on an Alistair MacLean novel. And that's a bioweapon movie. It's actually quite close in tone to the Boltings' 7 Days to Noon, which is a nuclear paranoia movie about a nuclear scientist who's disgusted with the arms race and threatens to blow up London to prove his point. The Satan Bug has Richard Basart as a germ warfare specialist who does the same thing, who's going to bring about the worst possible pandemic in order to prove his point. And that has, I think it's the first film that makes a big deal out of decontamination suits, which is it's the great image of all these films, is guys in these hazmat suits, we now call them, which they look a lot like spacemen. And it's the idea that the plague renders our planet alien, and we have to, our scientists come among us in these ways. But also in there's the sense that they aren't benign figures. In the Andromeda strain, we are with the guys in the hazmat suits. Our main characters are those guys. George Romero's The Crazies, the infection, codenamed Trixie, which is another bioweapon, gets loose in a small town and drives people mad. And that influenced David Cronenberg's movie Rabid, which is about actually that's also a genetic experiment gone wrong. That's a medical procedure that has spread rabies throughout a Canadian city. And in those films, the guys in the hazmat suits are as much a threat, and we are on the side of the infected, or the uninfected who just happen to be milling around in the danger areas. The realization that what are seen in earlier movies as sensible measures, which are quarantine and often summary execution, are actually hideously inhumane. And there's a sense that our authorities are looking for an excuse to do all these awful things to general population, us, and that being diseased is enough to render you a pariah. Just think of all the connotations of the term leper, which, strictly speaking, it's somebody suffering from a pitiable and horrible condition. As I say, now very treatable, but for a long time not. But lepers were people who had to be penned together or sent to leper colonies, despised and shunned. One of the reasons why in the Gospels such a big deal is made of Jesus curing lepers is that most people wouldn't even try. It shows his saintly divinity that he goes among lepers. He treats lepers as people because they were for a long time our ultimate outcasts. But the sense in the pandemic movie is that we are the lepers, or we are the potential lepers, and the people charged with the solution to the problem are not looking for solutions to individual problems. They are looking to do terrible things to the infected, and mostly the shoot 'em in the brain, George Romero approach does tend to be the one favoured by the authorities, who in these films are almost always inept. All the way down to the Steven Soderbergh Contagion, which has rather more of a sense of the genuine measures that would be used to deal with a pandemic. There is also a sense of the political pressures and even the social and media pressures that would make it difficult to limit the scope of any horrible viral outbreak. I have a soft spot for all those sort of they're kind of like forensic medical porn TV movies. I'm thinking of things like Fatal Contact, Bird Flu in America, and Plague City, SARS in Toronto, where you take whatever horrible disease is sort of a threat and you bring it to America. And we saw a lot of this discourse around the time of Ebola. It's like these things, they were not good news when they were happening in other parts of the world. But what's the real and the Soderbergh film is in fact the big budget version of this. Is it's bringing the Asian disease to us. What I always like in TV movies where there's a little counter at the bottom of the screen, say hours since patient zero, and the rising death toll or the infection toll that we get periodically throughout. There's a sort of teletype of who's died, and always somebody who we have formed a sympathetic relationship with will wind up coughing to death at some point in the film. And there have been a couple of more serious versions of this. I suppose and the band played on the historical film about the AIDS epidemic and the gradual spread of the disease, but also the work that had to be done by the CDC to even understand what it was and isolate it. That's a more sober, affecting version, but that's of course located in the past. It has as much to do with the various films about treatments of other diseases that have been conquered. What are really the inflammatory ones are the ones about the new diseases, the ones we haven't had yet. And for a long time, from the Satan bug through the Andromeda strain to the crazies to a whole bunch of other more lurid exploitation films, there was a sense that what we were worried of was bioweapons. We weren't as worried about bioweapons as we were about nuclear war, but it was a sort of, if you got bored of films about nuclear holocaust, well, you could unleash your terrible, the sense that something would be dropped in a laboratory that would cause the downfall of civilization. This is actually a joke in Roger Corman's Gas, Yeah, or it became necessary to destroy the world in order to save it, where somebody drops a test tube and I think everybody over 25 dies. Then in the TV miniseries of Stephen King's The Stand, we have a sort of serious version of that. Again, a bug gets out of a laboratory and wipes out most of humanity. In recent years, because we've had things like SARS and bird flu and AIDS, films have tended to have naturally occurring, naturally gestating diseases, and then to indict the authorities for their inept handling of them rather than say there's an original sin. We don't create these diseases anymore. We don't create the circumstances, but we aren't terribly good at handling, at reacting. Whereas what's quite impressive about the Andromeda strain is it is rather good. The scientists are completely on the ball, although in fact the system they have set up turns out to be fatally flawed in that its ultimate safety protocol is actually the thing which most threatens the world, because it's designed before they can conceive of an alien virus that might actually be spread by a nuclear explosion rather than cauterized by a nuclear explosion. And this is absolutely typical of Michael Crichton, the novelist. He had trained as a doctor before becoming a best-selling fiction writer, and he would later become a filmmaker with Westworld, but also he directed Coma, based on another big best-selling medical book by Robin Cook, who was, I suppose, sort of slightly more narrow focused than Crichton in terms of all his stories are about medical paranoia, whereas Crichton had just had a general paranoia about science, and yet paradoxically was fascinated by it. And the Andromeda strain has this thing that's in almost everything based on his books, down to Jurassic Park. This absolute obsession and fetishist love of technology, and the way that he imagines Project Wildfire, and in the film Robert Wise gets to depict it and explore it on screen. There's a fascination in the sheer details of the mechanics of how it works, and the book is full of charts and readouts and diagrams and sort of real sciencey science stuff, hard science stuff. And yet there's a sense that science is the big threat. We wouldn't have a problem with the Andromeda strain if we hadn't gone looking for it. Yeah, that's the thing. It is the hubris of building killer robots for our theme park, or genetically engineering dinosaurs, and yet we love the process. All Michael Crichton films have like educational bits. They're sort of lectures and film strips, which is actually a theme in science fiction cinema, American science fiction cinema. You see it. Them has an educational film strip, or so does Destination Moon. It's something that was embedded in 1950s type science fiction. The Andromeda strain is a very 1970s take on 1950s science fiction. It's sort of closely aligned with things like the Quatermass experiment and them, but it's so up to the minute and up to date. And Robert Wise, who'd made a great 1950s science fiction film, The Day the Earth Stood Still, actually, he was one of the great anonymous filmmakers. I think he completely tailored his personality to The Day the Earth Stood Still, The Body Snatcher, West Side Story, The Haunting, The Sound of Music. These are all Robert Wise films, and yet they don't have an overarching character. He brings a certain professionalism to everything, and I think for the Andromeda strain, he more or less invents a particularly chilly, detached style, which you find in other science fiction films of the period. It's quite close to the feel of George Lucas's THX 1138. I think he came along a bit after Joseph Sargent's Colossus, the Forbin project, which also has a bit of that feel. So maybe it's not a Wise invention so much, but he encapsulates a particular style which didn't last terribly long. It's not something that's used very often, I think, because the sort of George Romero, David Cronenberg, demented frenzy kind of took over. And also maybe we started to want a bit more character. One of the things that the film does that unusually for a novelist, Michael Crichton was very complimentary about the film adaptation of the Andromeda Strain. And he was asked if they'd made any changes to his book that he approved of. And I suspect because he knew he was interested in being a filmmaker, he said yes, there were. And he pointed out one or two tiny things. He said he loved the automatic sign saying escaped animal in the facility at the end, when referring once to the infection getting out of control, but also to the hero, James Olsen, struggling to deal with this sort of contrived and ridiculous situation where his own base is trying to kill him and he has to be. But he said that the main thing that the film did that he wishes he'd done was making one of the scientists a grumpy middle-aged woman and casting Kate Reid, a terrific underrated actress. She's also great in Louis Malle's Atlantic City, USA, as a character who could stand in for the audience, who would seem, genuinely convincing as a scientist, but also would grumble a bit at all the rigors of the procedures she has to go through. I think The Andromeda Strain is one of the great movies about what scientists are actually like. There is a certain sense of the way the astronauts in 2001 are depicted as calm, collected, unemotional, coping with a crisis, but also vast philosophical concepts in ways that seem almost comically underplayed and clipped. And we get a bit of that in The Andromeda Strain. But also there's the sense of the underlying prickliness that in these circumstances, anybody would melt down. And these people come quite close to it. So that mode was, it's an early 1970s feel. It's recently been revived a bit. I think Christopher Nolan's Interstellar has a little of that as an approach. And maybe even Steven Soderbergh's Solaris has something of that feel. And Duncan Jones's Moon. They all look back to this era of science fiction and find something cinematic and appealing in it, and are applying it to now cutting edge science. I mean, obviously, you can now look at the Andromeda Strain and be nostalgic about those big chattering printers. And I love the fact that the world nearly ends because of a paper jam in a printer, which is just so horribly believable when you are shown all the protocols they have for keeping the base going. And you have all these technicians working to see if there's some high-tech or computer interface problem when it's just a simple mechanical thing that your office temp would be told to deal with. But the look of it, the old-style computers, the green screen, which actually was a few years ahead of becoming a part of everybody's lives. There is now a kind of techno-nostalgia, and you see it in a few retro films. Computer chess recently plays a lot with the way these things look and feel, and there's something sort of blocky and tactile about tech then. But at the time, it seemed like smoothly up to date and up to the minute. And I suppose it's the style that Ridley Scott kicks against in Alien. The Nostromo in Alien is what Project Wildfire would look like after 6 years of people screwing up around it and messing the place up and some of the light bulbs going and not all the computers working and the paint peeling a bit. I suspect that Michael Crichton probably admired Alien because it is sort of his vision taken to the ultimate extreme. It was a movie that was not a huge hit in 1971, but everybody had heard of it. I think mainly there was a sort of blowback after the the Apollo program, where they had made actually a great fuss about the astronauts spending time in decontamination quarantine after their visit to the moon, the risk of bringing something back, as if the Quatermass experiment had been a genuine influence on the way NASA designed its space programs. But they didn't want astronauts coming back with a pandemic disease that could wipe out humanity. Not that that was terribly likely. I suppose that is part of the plot of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, but it was something floating around. They didn't want to take the risk. I don't know if they also probably didn't want their astronauts coming back with superpowers like the Fantastic Four. So that may have been part of it as well. But the Andromeda Strain kind of was a slow builder, I think, as a movie. It was not as melodramatic as Westworld, and it's certainly not as fantastical as Star Wars or Close Encounters or Alien, the films that really put science fiction on the map. There's a thing that I think rather patronizing filmmakers or writers or publicists say about it is not science fiction, it's science fact. And anytime somebody tells you that now, you just tune out and say, blah, 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 not listening. You really don't understand what science fiction is. Have you read H.G. Wells? But that was the kind of thing that some people said about the Andromeda Strain, which does have an utterly fantastical premise. The presence of a crystalline alien life form in, we're assuming, near Earth orbit. It's not quite said where the strain comes from. We assume it's mined from an asteroid. So it's the presence of alien life in the solar system. That is a genuinely fantastical science fiction idea. And the fact that it's a non-sapient life form, even that's not unprecedented. We have things like the magnetic monster or the monolith monsters or various other germ or bug or a mineral from outer space which will wipe out the world. That had been established as a science fiction movie theme in the 1950s and 60s. Even so, it's not outrageously fantastical. I assume that if you set it beside The Green Slime or Destination Inner Space or any number of Godzilla movies, then okay, we're not dealing with that level of craziness, but it's proper science fiction, and I think it should be acknowledged as that.